going to talk about Hearts in Atlantis by Stephen King, a book that I think is one of his most underrated works. Now, this is a video that's technically part of my long-running series of short fiction, my Stephen King short fiction project, where I'm going through all of the collections of short fiction and giving an overview, giving super short reviews for every story within, and then giving kind of summation with my favorites. I'm going to do that for this, but I'm also going to do kind of a regular review at the end of this video. And the reason is this is a very different kind of book. While it does contain short fiction, 5 stories, they are connected. And the sum of the parts is a lot better than the parts themselves for the most part. So I think it makes sense to kind of talk about this as the book as a whole. But I still want to do the same treatment just to keep it in the same format as all of these other videos that I've done previously on Stephen King's short fiction collections. So Hearts in Atlantis was published in 1999. The version that I have, this is the hardcover by Scribner. I think this is the second printing of the first edition. The version I have is 523 pages. Hearts in Atlantis has 5 stories within, 2 novellas and 3 short stories. The 2 novellas range from 154 pages to 248 pages, so kind of long novellas. And the 3 short stories range from 15 pages to 50 pages. I would say the overall effect of this book, as far as a genre is concerned, is magical realism, as the 1st, 4th, and 5th stories are all firmly in the magical realism realm. The 2nd and 3rd stories, the 2nd story is a work of historical fiction. You could probably say the 3rd story is as well. But overall, if you had to sum up one genre for this collection, I would say that it's magical realism. So the 5 stories within, the first one is called Low Men in Yellow Coats, and it's a novella-length story, and it's frankly one of King's finest novellas. It has coming-of-age story, a young protagonist, a great period piece. It has some Dark Tower tie-ins, just all the things that King does really well, he does really well in this novella. And while this is a collection that is connected, you could read that one by itself. The 2nd story in here is called Hearts in Atlantis. It is also a novella, and it could also stand alone. And this has a different protagonist. There's a minor tie-in with a minor character from the first 2 stories. And this is basically about a young man who's at college in 1966. And it talks about just kind of the social things that start to happen as he starts to awaken and starts to learn things. And it's fantastic. It's one of the best period pieces of its time set in the 1960s. The 3rd story is called Blind Willie, and this is a short story. And of the 5 in the collection, this is the one that I think was probably the weakest. I think especially by itself, it's not particularly strong, but there are some themes that tie into the overarching concept of Hearts in Atlantis as a whole. The 4th story is called Why We're in Vietnam, and this is actually set in 1999, and it has to deal with following a Vietnam vet in 1999, still dealing really with PTSD and all of those effects. And it talks about a lot of the things that he went through in in the Vietnam War, but then this story set in 1999 starts to tie back in and bring this whole collection to a full circle, because we get some magical realism elements that are coming back in at the very end of this story. And the final story, which is the short one, in many ways could be an epilogue, is called Heavenly Shades of Night, and it follows the main character from the very first novella, Low Men in Yellow Coats, but sets 39 years later. And it brings in the magical realism elements, and it brings the whole story to a close rather beautifully. As for a summation of this, my favorite in the collection, my 2 favorites, I would say there are 2 favorites in this collection. They're the 2 novellas, Hearts in Atlantis and Low Men in Yellow Coats. If I had to pick my absolute favorite, I would probably put Low Men in Yellow Coats, because it does just about everything that King does really well. Dark Tower tie-in, coming-of-age story, young protagonist, magical realism, some weird stuff going on. It's really fantastic. So I would call that one my favorite. As for this collection, in many ways, this fails as a short story collection because everything is linked. But that's okay, because the purpose of this was not to be a short story collection like Different Seasons or Night Shift. So if I had to rank it, like tier rank it, sheerly as a short story collection, I would probably make it a B tier placement. Now, if I were to place this as to what I think overall this volume is, I think this is S tier King. and I know that's an unpopular opinion. I look at the ratings on Goodreads, and it's obvious that people went in with different expectations for this book. I think if you went in thinking, oh, this is going to be a collection of short fiction, you're going to be disappointed because it's a connected stories of short fiction. If you're going in expecting the next King novel and you find out that it's 5 different stories with 4 different protagonists, you're probably going to be disappointed as well. But I also think that the biggest reason that this maybe has a lower composite ranking from its readers is that this is King kind of flexing his literary muscles in many ways. This isn't the pulpy King that wrote Carrie. This is the King that had something to say, and what he had to say was something about the 1960s. And that's what I'll talk about in the full review of this in the second half of this video. So, Hearts in Atlantis by Stephen King is one of his most underrated works, and it's a connected collection of short fiction. I don't know if I worded that very well, but that's what it is. There are 5 stories here, and they all connect, especially at the end, and they connect very beautifully at the end. And as I mentioned, I don't know if you watched the first half of this video or not, but if you didn't, I mentioned there that I think going in with the right expectations is going to probably aid your enjoyment of this book. If you go in knowing that it's 5 stories with 4 different protagonists and they are interconnected, you're probably more likely to enjoy this than if you just go in thinking it's short fiction or a novel or something like that. So the first novella in here, Low Men in Yellow Coats, is fantastic because it shows you so many things that King does really well. First of all, we get a protagonist. His name's Bobby Garfield. I think he's 11 years old in this story. And we know, any of you that have read King, he's very good at giving you a child protagonist. And Bobby Garfield is one of his better ones. And we follow Bobby's story with his friends and the things that you go through in adolescence. Bobby lives with his mother, who's a single mother because she's a widow. And you get to see in this story kind of what the setting in 1960s is like for a single mother and a woman in the workplace. You get to see some of those things in here because that's the overarching idea of this book as he talks about the 1960s. Even though 3 of the stories are set in the 80s and 90s, it's still talking about 1960s life, especially in these first 2 novellas that kind of set the stage for what the entire work is about. But in this story, we get Bobby meeting an old man named Ted Brautigan, and that's where the magical realism elements come into the story here. And they tie into King's Dark Tower. And that's the reason why I first reread this story actually 5 or 6 years ago. And I reread it because I'm doing a very long term, it's taken about a decade because I'm just kind of slow rolling it, a reread of all the things that tie into the Dark Tower, and then I'm going to reread the Dark Tower. So I reread this about 5, 6 years ago, and it blew me away because I enjoyed it so much more the second time around. Well, the third time around, even more, enough for me to say that this is the top 2 or 3 most underrated work by Stephen King. And Low Men in Yellow Coats with a Dark Tower tie-in is fantastic. And the child protagonist, coming-of-age story, magical realism elements, it's in King's wheelhouse, and it's just a fantastic story. But for me, in many ways, the second story here, which is called Hearts in Atlantis, is the heart of this book. And that's not an intended pun there. Because I feel that you really learn literally in the first 2 paragraphs what King wants to talk about. When I came to the University of Maine in 1966, there was still a Goldwater sticker, tattered and faded but perfectly readable, AUH2O for USA, on the old station wagon I inherited from my brother. When I left the university in 1970, I had no car. What I did have was a beard, hair down on my shoulders, and a backpack with a sticker on it reading, "Richard Nixon is a war criminal." The button on the collar of my denim jacket read, "I ain't no fortunate son." College is always a time of change, I guess, the last major convulsion of childhood. But I doubt there were ever changes of such magnitude as those faced by the students who came to their campuses in the late 60s. Most of us don't say much about those years now, not because we don't remember them, but because the language which we spoke back then has been lost. When I try to talk about the 60s, when I even try to think about them, I'm overcome by horror and hilarity. I see bell-bottom pants and earth shoes. I smell pot and patchouli, incense and peppermints. And I hear Donovan Leitch singing his sweet and stupid song about the continent of Atlantis. lyrics that still seem profound to me in the watches of the nights when I can't sleep. The older I get, the harder it is to let go of that song's stupidity and hold on to its sweetness. I have to remind myself that we were smaller then, small enough to love our brightly hued lives under the mushrooms, all the time believing them to be trees, shelter from the sheltering sky. I know that doesn't make real sense, but it's the best I can do. Hail Atlantis. So the tumultuous 1960s, I think, is something that, if you haven't lived through it, which I haven't, having been born in the 70s, we can only read about it and we can only imagine. And I think the beginning of this novella kind of sets the stage for what he talks about, primarily in this story, but it does permeate the entire story. We don't get the same protagonist here. We get a different protagonist. The only link between the first two novellas and Hearts in Atlantis is a secondary character that is in both stories and is a secondary character in both stories. But in Hearts in Atlantis, we find a young man, 1966, University of Maine, and it's the time of big social upheaval. It's the time of the Vietnam War. And what I think makes this novella so brilliant are the small moments here. The moments where the character reflects back and realizes that it was the first time he ever saw a peace sign. Or when he's reflecting back, and because at the end of this story, the story's about Hearts in Atlantis. Hearts, there's a perpetual card game going on in his dorm, which reminded me of college because I remember the same thing. That's kind of bringing down people's grades because they're obsessed with playing cards. And I remember that as a youngster as well, because half of my dorm flunked out first semester because they were playing cards all night. But I digress. The thing the reason I wanted to mention that is at the end of this story, this character goes to one of his professors and asks what he can do to make sure that he passes and he doesn't flunk out of college. And he says, looking back, I realized that my professors really wanted me to not flunk out of college because I'd be dead in Vietnam in a year. It's the little innocuous moments in this story that really just lends a weight to what was going on. Just kind of this augur behind you of this war that was going on with the draft, but at the same time, this peace movement going on. And for me, that's what made this just fantastic. The last two times I read this, it just absolutely blew me away because, again, I didn't live through the 1960s, but I feel that King brought the setting to life so well that I kind of felt like it, that I felt like I understood. King says in his epilogue something like that the 1960s are something that you can't believe happened unless you were there. And I think he brings it to life extremely well, especially in this particular story within Hearts in Atlantis. The three short stories after that deal with some secondary characters. Again, two more different protagonists, but both of these secondary characters tie into the very first story that we had, Low Men in Yellow Coats. And one is Blind Willie is a Vietnam vet who has a very peculiar way of making money. And it kind of talks about thematically what these Vietnam veterans had to do when they got back and the things they had to deal with when they got back from the war. And the fourth story in here as well, which is called Why We're in Vietnam, kind of has a similar theme where you're just understanding a little bit of the plight of the Vietnam veteran and coming back. And in this character's case, again, a character who was a secondary character in the very first story of Hearts in Atlantis, what you see is that it's a character that is still dealing with PTSD 30 years after the war and still hallucinating and dealing with the effects of the things that he saw, the things he had to do, and the things that have just stuck with him throughout the years. And in this story, King starts to weave magical realism elements back in so that in the last story we can go first circle and we meet full circle. We meet Bobby Garfield 39 years later. He's like 50 years old in this last story, and the story came together beautifully. I think King's conclusions are oftenly maligned, and I'm not going to say they're necessarily unfairly maligned because I think a lot of times in a Stephen King novel or a Stephen King collection of short fiction like this that's connected, I think a lot of times the journey's worth it, even if the ending isn't 100% satisfying. Well, I thought the ending here was 100% satisfying. I really loved the end of this. I thought it was a beautiful ending, cathartic ending to this story that started back in 1960 and ended in 1999. But once again, I think this is a extremely underrated work of King's. I think it's King at his most literary, with maybe a few exceptions. Like I think Dolores Claiborne is actually one of his most masterful books that most of us don't talk about, myself included. But I think it shows the scope of King, that he's able to tell a story like this, a story that's about something. And when I say about something, like about the 1960s, about something very important, not just about, a haunted car or something like that. I love him for that stuff too. But Hearts in Atlantis is fantastic. I highly recommend it. Go in with the correct expectations, and I hope that you love it as much as I do. So hey, if you've read Hearts in Atlantis, let's talk in the comments section below. I'd love to hear your thoughts about it. I think it's one of King's most underrated works. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Either way, let's chat. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. You can also find me on Twitter, Goodreads, and the Fireside Discord. I'd love to interact with you there. As always, thank you for watching. Until next time, goodbye.